University, who has quite an impressive list of books he published during his career. I just mentioned a few of them that seem to be of special interest for the topic. So I guess the last book that's already been out is the book on postmodernism and revolution in religious theory, toward the semiotics of, what is it called?
Toward the semiotics of the event.
Of the event, right. But you also wrote quite different stuff, like the book entitled Global Christ. I think that testifies to your interest in globalization issues.
Right.
Stuff like that. Also very interesting focus of your research is on body and gender. The book titled The Engendered God. That's already from the 90s, if I remembered it rightly. And for me, really interesting, but I didn't get it yet. It's very difficult to find your books here. Is the book was entitled Painted Black, because it seems to focus, to revolve around issues of violence and so-called religious cults. So that's, yeah, maybe some...
It's hard to get in America too, so...
That's so good. Good to know, I'm glad. Well, and even you also worked on New Age and these issues that are related to the questions regarding religion and its substitute. So, I hope all this will in some sense come in now, and I'm happy to leave you the floor. Thank you, Carl.
Well, thanks. I'm going to do something very straightforward here, and that's give a philosophy talk. But I will say that I want to kind of come at some of these issues from the standpoint of the later Derrida. Derrida is, if there's any philosophy that I kind of hold dear, and I don't like to call myself a Husserlian or Derridian or Heideggerian, but I guess if you want to call me something, Derridian would be the best term, because I've kind of sojourned with Derrida my whole career. But at the same time, I understand that Derrida is really in some ways a radical Husserlian, and his early work was all effort to try to come to terms with Husserl. People forget that. They talk about his relationship to Levinas and Heidegger, but everything he wrote in the 60s was in some ways an effort to try to solve some of the kind of questions that we're trying to work through here. Like the origin of geometry, which is his book on, his dissertation was on Genesis and Husserl and so forth, very technical issues, but the whole Derridian project of deconstruction can be seen in many ways, I think, as an effort to, in using different kind of terminology, make good on promises that Husserl had made. So what I want to do is I want to start with Husserl's his later works. Actually, he wrote in the 1930s, including his famous Vienna lecture, which was given right here in the city, pretty much about the time when he was no longer allowed to teach in Germany because of the Aryanization that was going on with the Nazi regime. So in The Crisis of the European Sciences and Transcendental Philosophy, which is the title of these collected later essays, Husserl wrote sometimes before his death the following: "The struggle of our times, the only ones which are significant, are struggles between humanity which has collapsed and humanity which still has its roots but is struggling to keep them or find new ones." Like Heidegger may or may not have something to do with Husserl's banishment from the academy as part of the Aryanization movement in the German university system, Husserl was desperately trying to find philosophy's roots, which he had located in the transcendental method. Husserl's transcendental approach, the epoche, preoccupied from its inception with what in The Crisis refers repeatedly as, quote, the enigma of subjectivity, always seemed to point in a direction beyond the Cartesian or even the Kantian notion of the subject. The plenitude of fully experienced subjecthood, the Husserlian ego inextricably immersed in its conditioning Lebenswelt, actually consisted in a covert displacement, as Jean-Luc Marion would observe more than 6 decades after Husserl's death. The displacement consists in the fact that phenomenology, this is a quote, no longer concerns the knowledge of the phenomenon, but the knowledge of their modes of exposition, and therefore it no longer aims at the foundation of the sciences, as Husserl insisted, but at the thought of phenomenality, end quote. That's from Marion's Reduction and Givenness. What Marion in the same treatise goes on to call, quote, the phenomenality of the phenomenon as the secret transcendental attitude, which he argues is more about the problem of the subjective constitution of the phenomenalness itself than about the coming to presence of the putative phenomenon. It's something that the original Kantian transcendental formulation could not overcome, as Heidegger himself suggests in his early work, Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics. Now, as Marion points out, quote, consciousness therefore determines phenomenality by reducing every phenomenon to the certitude of an actual presence, far from phenomenality requiring that consciousness be itself determined by the conditions and the modes of givenness, which are always multiple and disconcerting. It is this observation of Marion, which he makes relatively early on in his career, that serves as the fulcrum for his own later reduction to givenness. Later in Reduction and Givenness, Marion finds this tendency even in Heidegger's own Dasein analytic. Quote, by the constraining grace of the reduction as the instance of givenness and presence, the reduced phenomenon is reduced to being that is present here and now, end quote. If givenness are what Hegel, who provides in many ways the backstory, not only for Husserl or Marion, but also Derrida, if givenness, or what Hegel calls the this here, the dies da, is both the starting and end points for phenomenology, then what really is left of the transcendental element in any putative epoche or reduction? And that's our question. Marion seems to want to do an end run around the entire strategy of the epoche itself. Appearance, as he says, quote, could reach the full status of the phenomenon only inasmuch as appearing is sufficient for the accomplishment of being. Apparition is sufficient for being only inasmuch as it in appearing is also perfectly gives itself. But thus it gives itself perfectly by the sole fact that it appears only inasmuch as it is reduced to its givenness for consciousness. Now, interestingly, this kind of insight underpinning most of Marion's so-called new phenomenology can also be construed as the occasion for the current fashion, at least in the United States, of which actually comes out of France, of what's called speculative realism, with its peremptory denial of any transcendental position, or what Melissu dubs correlationism. It is, if we may take the liberties with Derrida's rhetoric, a kind of reductionism without reduction, a subjecting or gifting of the given without a subject. Clearly, since the entrance of post-structuralist critique into the academic mainstream more than 4 decades ago, the subject itself has been problematized all the way up to the threshold of extinction. But what if this inexorable trend of desubjectification over such a time span missed the point about what Husserl really had in mind? And what if, in some sense, the transcendental standpoint was really a kind of threshold for philosophy? Not an epoche without epoche, so much as a passage into a different kind of presence that does not presence, let alone present itself, but forces the presencing of presence at its very inauguration. In The Crisis, Husserl focuses in a manner uncharacteristic of his earlier work on the manner in which the dominance of modern epistemology by what he calls the objective sciences has made any appreciation by philosophy of its own historical genesis and tasks impossible. Earlier on, Husserl insisted that phenomenology must become the most rigorous of sciences, die strengste Wissenschaft, and therefore resorted to the method of bracketing in order to resist the common sense promptings of reflection from the natural attitude. In sum, the early Husserl amounted to a type of latter-day Platonism without Platonism, capturing at the same time the imminent positioning of a philosophical inquiry without Descartes' self-reflective foundationalism, a ground plan for the full flowering of Greek noesis without skepsis. In the Husserl prior to World War I, the Lebenswelt did not matter, and therefore did not have at all to be foregrounded in his charting of the course of phenomenology as a whole, because it was already implied, so far as Husserl was concerned, in the concept of intentionality as the terrain of applicable evidence and unclarified meaning overall. But for a variety of reasons, Husserl became eventually convinced that the life world was messier and more volatile, if not unmanageable, than he had previously presupposed. As it builds toward the end, and especially in the Vienna lecture delivered in 1935, when it was added as an appendix, the crisis seems to be more a work of evangelism on the part of a former philosophical idealist who, in his twilight years, had suddenly found religion. Husserl, of course, was responding to the lowering fascist menace in Germany and elsewhere, and he unflinchingly alluded to these trends as the basis of what he had considered an even more profounder crisis, that of the Western project apotheosized in the Enlightenment of the 18th century, of the pursuit of autonomous reason itself. What in the Vienna lecture he refers to as the crisis of European existence can only be understood, according to Husserl, quote, against the background of the teleology of European history, end quote. A teleology rooted in the cosmological aspirations and speculative preferences of the early Greek philosophers. One must, Husserl insists, quote, work out the concept of Europe as the historical teleology of the infinite goals of reason, end quote. But this teleology has somehow been aborted, according to Husserl, because, quote, the essence of rationalism has been rendered superficial through its entanglement in naturalism and objectivism. Okay, so those of us who know Husserl know that, this is nothing, striking about this. But phenomenology, therefore, Husserl suggests elsewhere in the text, has as its unmistakable calling, its beruf, which of course is a theological term originally, the reactivation of this failed teleology. At the same time, this project can no longer be dialectical or Hegelian, as Husserl says. Here he has the same intuition as Nietzsche did throughout the 1880s, namely that the dialectical impulse has killed both God and philosophy, leading to a strange sort of decadence in thinking where the ancient and honorable quest of scientia has lost its aim. For Husserl, phenomenology offers an unprecedented new view of ratio, reason, within the infinite reach and force of Geist, or Hegelian spirit. What Hegel describes, quote, as a truly universal and radical coming to terms with itself in the form of a universal responsible science. One, indeed, quote, where all conceivable questions, questions of being and questions of norm, questions of what is called existence, find their place. Now there's a definite, in Husserl at least, there's a definite echo of Husserl's fundamental ontology here. Yet Husserl's would-be wake-up call is focused on something much grander than reorienting philosophy away from what Descartes called the claritas and perspicuitas of knowledge. He wants to orient it, it's more than just reorient it toward the ambiguities of finitude. In the third part of the crisis, Husserl waxes almost rhapsodically on what this new calling for philosophy might mean. It comes down to nothing more or less than a radicalization of the phenomenological epoche itself. Husserl says, in effect, that the now well-known epoche he articulated in ideas turns out to be only an initial gesture. As a, quote, first methodological leap that has already come into view through preliminary reflections hitherto carried out, end quote, it is sufficient. What is required even further, though, he says, is an epoche in respect to the objective sciences overall. The different practices and theoretical procedures of the objective sciences themselves need to be bracketed in order to allow philosophy itself to discover the illimitable intuitions of philosophy as it explores the life world. Phenomenology is now perhaps bracketed and put in its place, even Husserlian phenomenology. Phenomenology, he says, is simply one vocation among others since, quote, it is basically a matter of indifference whether one is a cobbler or a phenomenologist, or also whether one is a phenomenologist or a positive scientist, end quote. What one needs to adopt is what Husserl at this stage terms, quote, the total phenomenological attitude, in effect, the epoche of all epoches. It is an epoche that constitutes, quote, a complete personal transformation comparable in the beginning to a religious conversion, end quote. That's Husserl's own words. Such dramatic language, which is unusual for Husserl, overlays somewhat paradoxically both a modest as well as a more ambitious set of objectives. The less pretentious aim, so far as he's concerned, consists in mapping a new kind of objectivity that is not subordinated to the mathematizing of nature as we know it, but is a venture into determining in some way the, quote, the general structure of the life world. Such a view considers bodies as actual, but not bodies in the sense of physics. Some pages later, on the other hand, Husserl veers back to the transcendental attitude, but now he seeks to establish his new mode of universality in the plenitude of intersubjective perspectives and apprehensions. One can in no way be satisfied with the standpoint of the subject alone, even as such subjectivity transcends itself inevitably. The murky intentionalities of the act of cogito are revealed in this setting as simply the stuff of a vast ocean of cognitive possibilities that open up a realm of transcendental knowledge that is no longer reducible to merely an assemblage of simple intensities or a system of distinguishable positivities. There is no way left, as Husserl says, to document these various strains of noemata in a manner that is even any more empirically justifiable. In the crisis, Husserl foresaw the very failures of rating epistemologies, and it would finally take post-structuralism a generation later to dismantle them. Whereas Heidegger is often credited with anticipating post-structuralism, as well as deconstruction, because Heidegger is the one that talks about the destruction of metaphysics. We find really this is what Husserl himself had been doing at the end of his career, if not perhaps throughout the whole of his career. He had already envisioned a way beyond Kantian pure reason that required neither Derrida's famous aporias nor Deleuze's semiotics of desire. Ironically, according to Edward Bering in his study of the origins of deconstruction entitled The Young Derrida in French Philosophy, it was this kind of almost obsessive wrestling with the issues posed by Husserl in the crisis that framed Derrida's own transition from phenomenology to what by the late 1960s had become his own thoroughgoing philosophy of language, which he called deconstruction. Bering shows how Derrida, especially in his master's thesis on the problem of Genesis, was thoroughly, in his earliest career, a dedicated Husserlian and to a certain extent a closet Christian existentialist. As Derrida argues in his dissertation completed in the mid-50s, the question of Genesis, what Heidegger in a different context had called the project of the overcoming of metaphysics as the issue of origin or Ursprung, Derrida raises up an untamed specter for any scientific or philosophical pretension to objectivity. Derrida writes, quote unquote, Genesis, which is examined naively and in the most formal way possible, brings together two contradictory meanings in its concept, one of origin and one of becoming. In some ways, this observation is Badiou's theory of the event avant la lettre. But Derrida was seeking to refute both conventional historicism and Marxian dialectical materialism in regard to how philosophy is grounded and how it proceeds. Quote, I'm quoting Derrida, there is no genesis except within a temporal and ontological totality which encloses it. Every genetic product is produced by something other than itself. In other words, any sort of philosophical epoche or effort to envision, like Descartes, an Archimedean point from which the world might be moved has an unintended outcome.
It does not give it being itself as a form of impassive comprehension of the essence of things, but something akin to Merleau-Ponty's wild being, the being of becoming. Such a genesis, quote, this is Derrida, is given at first both as ontologically and temporally indefinite and as an absolute beginning, as continuity and discontinuity, identity, and alterity. And I'm going to skip some, I think, rather interesting pages looking at the genesis of Derrida here to get to the question of the gift. I want to turn to what comes out of all this in these meditations on Husserl is his early works, what might be called his proto-deconstructionist work, particularly the essay Force and Signification, published in 1963. Derrida sallies forth here with a post-structuralist rendering of Hegel's speculative sentence in his suggestion that writing, as opposed to presence in the ontological sense, writing is inaugural. Inaugural writing is, he writes, dangerous and anguishing. It does not know where it is going. No knowledge can keep it from the essential precipitation toward the meaning that it constitutes, and that is primarily as its future. Writing does not create so much as because of its freedom to bring forth the already there as a sign of the freedom to augur. It's even a little bit of an overtones of Sard here. It is a freedom of a response which acknowledges as the only horizon the world is a history and speech which can only say, being has already begun. End quote. The worker text is being in force, which is, as it was for Hegel, being as temporalization, as differentiation, as something coming into being. In the same essay, Derrida applauds and cites Hegel. To say that force is the origin of the phenomenon to say nothing. By its very articulation, force becomes a phenomenon. Hegel demonstrates convincingly that the explication of a phenomenon by a force is a tautology. We were talking about tautologies earlier today. But in saying this, one must refer to language's peculiar inability to emerge from itself in order to articulate its origin, to discover its genesis, and not to the thought of force. Force is what forces thought, not only in Derrida, but also in Hegel, according to Derrida, and writing for that matter. It forces thought into its mobility, into what he calls its session and supersession. Quote, force is the other of language without which language would not be what it is, end quote. But the force of the word and the force of thought derives from the duplicity which Hegel recognized in the dialectical thrust of discursivity as a whole. For Hegel, force is always dividing itself and forcing itself back upon itself, hence the dialectical return of the proposition back to itself, the so-called speculative sentence. Hegel introduces the notion of force, Kraft, in subsection 3 of the opening portion of the Phenomenology. It is the bridge notion that joins Hegel's initial analysis of sense certainty, and the primitive determination by the mind of what is meaningful to the fuller exploration of self-consciousness. Force is what shapes or lends plasticity, as Catherine Malibu would say, to the roiling diversity of elements in the process of conceptual construction and deconstruction, for that matter. These sundry materien, in Hegel's words, mutually interpenetrate. But it is only because of the workings of force that they come together in an anticipation of spirit becoming conscious of itself as the concrete universal. These materien, posited, this is a quote from Hegel, posited as independent, directly pass over into their unity, and their unity directly unfolds its diversity, and this once again reduces itself to unity. But this movement is what is called force, end quote. Force expresses itself, yet force remains, quote, within itself as the expression, end quote. Force is what draws and holds together its constituents and its alterity or its otherness. Expression is the materialization of this force, its shaping and configuring. And so this whole idea we find in post-structuralism that Deleuze calls expressionism in philosophy, which he's claimed to derive from Spinoza. This is what Derrida is talking about, except he's deriving it from Hegel. Force is rather itself, and this is again a quote from Hegel. Force is rather itself this universal medium in which the moments subsist, but it is also the force that drives the formative concept beyond these momentary configurations. In fact, force is itself this reflectedness into itself, or the superstition of the expression, the oneness in which form in which it appears as another vanishes. Force is this other, is force driven back unto itself, end quote, from Hegel. If we realize that it is force that drives the dialectic then is not so much negation other than as it is differentiation. It is a kind of plastic formative dynamism that is at times gritty, chaotic, and violent. And I go on to argue here that this is what Hegel is really the original proto-deconstructionist, because when he's talking about the power of the negative, that and the self-realization of the absolute spirit, and the quote that was given yesterday, he says, "Such a life is not the light that shrinks from death and keeps itself untouched by devastation. It wins its truth only when in utter dismemberment it finds itself. Spirit is the power only by looking the negative in the face and tarrying with it. This tarrying, or verweilen with the negative, is the magical power of Zauberkraft that converts it into being." And of course, this is actually taken right out of the speech by Mephistopheles in basically seducing Faust into his new mode of being. So this kind of Faustian bargain that the dialectic makes, but it's a kind of magical force, a Zauber force. So what I go on to say, therefore, is that Derrida's force of language is closely akin to Hegel's force of a persistent conceptual genesis, the venture of spirit. It is the other that keeps impinging, that often backgrounds and foregrounds. What's my time? How much time do I have here? When did we start?
It's been 27 minutes since you've been talking.
Yeah, I'll try. Let me move on then. This point, I think, is very interesting, but I won't belabor it. Force, then, for Derrida is what keeps spirit alive. Derrida does not make this claim explicitly, but it is obvious from his constant referral in Of Spirit to his earlier work he did at the time of the publication, Force and Signification. Of Spirit is his meditation on Heidegger, which is sort of one of his major transitional works from what we would call the preoccupation with texts and semiology to the political and the religious. Of Spirit is less a definitive than a transitional work, a kind of meditative and hermeneutical space for Derrida to rescue the reputation of deconstruction as an epical pivot in the history of modern philosophy, and not as simply a useful critical tool for literary and cultural theorists. With Of Spirit, we have the first inklings of the themes prevailing in his so-called political, religious, and ethical years. The ongoing crisis for Derrida is a realization of the impossibility of philosophy striving for eidetic certainty to underwrite the ethical. In short, the crisis of the European sciences, as Husserl understood it, came down to a certain destitution of Kantian practical reason. Whereas Derrida had a glimmering of this mode of destitution, the deeper issue, that he says Of Spirit, is tantamount to the question of subjectivity per se. The origin of the ethical belongs not to the realm of the transcendental, but to that of the subject as it is doubled in its interior incommensurability with its moral positing. Every gesture toward the ideal aim of acting on a maxim of pure practical reason rests in the failure of the subject itself, the kind of inconsolable double-mindedness that Kierkegaard, whom Derrida ponders extensively, and through Lacan made the focal point of his own method of what might be termed existential structural psychoanalysis. I'm talking here about Lacan. For Derrida, it has one more solemn requirement. It means becoming responsible. Quote, and this is from The Gift of Death, "To responsibility is the experience of absolute decisions made outside of knowledge or given norms, made therefore through the very ordeal of the undecidable. It is only in the faith of death, often our own death, but also the possibility of the death of another, that we learn responsibility," says Derrida. But this responsibility comes, Derrida reminds us, as a gift. Furthermore, is it a gift that also entails a sacrifice, as in the case of Abraham and Isaac, the prototype for what Derrida, by reading Patočka, terms the secret of European responsibility, a secret that always frames the crisis. So in other words, this is the secret of the crisis, which is what you might say the inability of force to resolve itself dialectically in what might be called the consciousness of Europe, the crisis of the European Wissenschaft. This sacrifice, specifically what Derrida says is a blood or carnivorous sacrifice, he says in Force of Law, is essential to the structure of subjectivity. What does Derrida mean by this statement when he comes across as merely an incidental observation, but in certain respects contextualizes his own comprehensive view of religion, ethical commitment, and political theory? As he argues coming in Kierkegaard in his lengthy exposition on the meaning of Abraham's willing to sacrifice Isaac, it consists surprisingly in the Christian break with the Greek orgiastic mysteries, on which Platonism, along with Western ontology, as we all know, is founded. Hence, post-structuralism's celebrated reversal of Platonism has nothing to do, ironically, with the preference for the Dionysian over the Apollonian, but with the recognition, according to Derrida, of the reality of the wholly other, in contrast to classical ontology. It is the riddle of intersubjectivity that even Husserl was able to resolve through his transcendental method, an intersubjectivity that is much more than a series of incommensurable variations in the subjective experience of the presence of the object, but the experience of the subject as pure other, and vice versa. Thus, in looking at Husserl, Derrida, who begins his career by charting a pathway through phenomenology, but beyond phenomenology, the crisis of the European sciences amounts to the inability to account for the phenomenological thing, except as perhaps the Lacanian Das Ding, quote, the thing that is impossible for us to imagine, as Lacan puts it in the Ethics of Psychoanalysis. In the Lacanian theory of the symbolic, which infuses the whole of post-structuralism like a barely perceptible but all-permeating mist, the thing as alter subject is the objet pédia in Lacan's terms, the object of impossible desire, and therefore not an object at all. What is this object? It is the gift, which can only come through what Derrida calls blood sacrifice, requiring the radical conversion of the subject as percipient ego into the subject as that site of response when confronted by the summon and claim of the holy other. As Derrida says, quote, the mysterium tremendum announces another way of giving death or granting oneself death. This time the word gift is uttered, end quote. The other way of apprehending death and of acceding to responsibility comes from a gift received from the other, from the one, in absolute transcendence. Sees me without my seeing, holds me in his hands while remaining inaccessible, end quote. Later on, Derrida asks, quote, on what condition is responsibility such as gift possible? On the condition that the good no longer be a transcendental objective, a relationship between objective things, but the relation to the other, a response to the other. Here it's obvious that Derrida has at last succeeded also to Levinas's dictum that it is not ontology but ethics that must be understood as first philosophy. But what makes the gift a true gift in this sense, as opposed to a mere Gegebenheit of phenomenology, which would include Marion's reduction to the given, is that it calls into being, quote, a structure of invisible interiority that is called, in Kierkegaard's sense, subjectivity, end quote. Derrida's answer to Husserl's crisis, therefore, comes to the realization that the question of the self, the Cartesian question is ontology of the self-same, must be put under erasure once and for all, and that the matter, Sache, of the subject replace it in its entirety. The matter of the subject is really the ethical challenge of the given as gift, a GABA without any possible transcendental synthesis, an es gibt that sets in motion what Derrida understands as a whole new economy of decisive and responsible agency, an agency without any form of epistemology to underwrite it. Linguistically speaking, and this is something that the book that the latter book that I wrote on the revolution of religious theory, this approach to subjectivity actually results in a kind of reductio ad singularitatem, reduction to the singularity, a realization that nothing is ultimately thinkable without what I call the orthogonal relationship between being and alterity, a relationship that is not planar as in predicative logic, but one that maps the seeming asymmetry between the event of destructured subjectivity and the signifying demands of the infinite, which always interrupts our thought and confounds us at right angles to the trajectory of philosophical explanation and scientific discourse, particularly as Husserl understood it. The genuine question of philosophy, therefore, is the question one commonly asks in the event of meeting and engagement. And I've been told that in German, which means the same, but it's not polite in English, it's kind of hip to say it, was gibt's, or what gives. What gives is the other to whom we're infinitely responsible, as Kierkegaard, Levinas, and Derrida would all say, and who does not belong to an economy of I give so that you may give back, do et des, as Marcel Mauss formulated it. An economy of reciprocity and transaction. A non-economy and a non-philosophy, if we may borrow Francois Laruelle's expression, of what is theologically called grace, or gratia. The crisis of the European sciences and of continental philosophy today is the refusal to accept this donation of grace that has been offered by the post-structuralist revolution over the past 4 decades. It is the same gift that Nietzsche's Zarathustra seeks to bring down from the mountain, only to realize that it is hardly understood except by his animals. Nietzsche understood Zarathustra's gift as untimely, unzeitgemäßig, but as Derrida shows us, the time may finally arrive. I'm sorry, what? For what?
From doing this parcours, this tour, not really a tour de force, but a
Tour de Derrida, yeah.
to the Derrida, from the early Husserl and his appropriation of Derrida, via later, till your own interpretation. Thanks. I think there's many interesting issues to discuss. Please, the floor is open.
Yes.
Thank you very much. So if I understood correctly, the very provocative phrase at the end of your talk, the new crisis being the impossibility for contemporary philosophy to accept, to receive this gift,
Yeah.
this hyperbolic gift. But the question I'd like to ask is it receivable, this gift, by contemporary continental philosophy? Is it receivable? That is, forgive the ought, but ought it not to remain not received?
Yeah, and it's interesting because, again, you go back to Husserl's statement that's often overlooked in the way we understand Husserl about since he had a religious conversion, he realized the limits of the previous epoche, and then he starts to talk now about phenomenology, not as a Strengthswissenschaft, but as a Beruf, a calling. In other words, exactly what Luther, thought he had received from God. And so that kind of, we say, well, really we're involved in a kind of religious quest. I think Derrida, in some ways, in a much more sophisticated and longer way, and with also this vast and different kind of audience than Husserl ever has, goes through the same kind of circle, and it's interesting that Derrida's last seminar is The Beast and the Sovereign, when he's talking about the whole question of the animal. And when he's going back to Levinas, he's going back to the whole question of intersubjectivity, and he's asking this question of the gift. It's not the indecipherable Heideggerian as gibt, but in some way it's the gift that comes from my response to the other, or the gift as gaze, as we were talking about the last hour and so forth. So what do we do with this? Well, he says, well, in some ways he finally goes over to the side of Levinas. Well, it's all about infinite responsibility, which requires the gift of death. So what we would do, what would philosophy would do with that? I mean, that's a good question. I'm not even sure what I'd do with it, I mean, in some ways the religious question is not a marginal question. I would honestly say that I think that the so-called new phenomenologists influenced by Marion, fortunately Jason just walked out of the room as I'm about to say this, but there he is. That I don't think they get this either. They don't get that it's not about that which is given or radically given or incommensurably given, but it's that which the gift that gives in such a way that now one is infinitely responsible, almost in, you might say, the pure freedom that Sartre was angling for with a different kind of dialogue, different kind of discourse. So that'd be my take. I'm not sure, I mean, it's kind of heady, it's kind of exciting, Marx's famous quip, heretofore philosophy has only interpreted the world, now the point is to change it. Well, maybe that's our Baruch. Or maybe not.
Well, nobody else. I'd be interested in exactly what you think, or how you understand what you call the new in the crisis, the new crisis.
I mean, what Derrida understands.
So, or your understanding. I mean,
Yeah.
in Husserl and in the Vienna lecture, the last section in the Vienna lecture is a very, very interesting section, because Husserl here is talking about, and that might already build some bridge for what you're trying to explain. He's talking about the Unwesen. The Unwesen, das Unwesen der gegenwärtigen Krise. Und Krise is put in quotation marks here.
Yeah.
It's the only time it's put in quotation marks. So, and then when it goes on to talk about teleology, on one hand, the Unwesen, which is translated into English, by the way, is disarray, and this is exactly not what it's all about. That's not a simple disarray. Unwesen is much, much stronger. So
Right.
this is already bringing in some spectral logic. So that's much stronger, by the way. But the point here in Husserl is that here now, again, he brings in Europe. He brings in Europe, he brings in this specific teleology of reason, and I wonder if you didn't mention Europe. In what sense would you say that that the new response to the new crisis would have to revolve around something that comes after Europe?
Yeah, well, that's a whole thing. I do blog for this blog, I have an even called Political Theology, and I'll probably do it once a month, my next blog, particularly with what's going on in Eastern Europe, and all of a sudden this kind of sudden unexpected transformation of Russia. We don't know what this all means or where it's going. And, specters of 1914, specters of 1939. No, that's not. Those comparisons don't. I mean, it's interesting because just if I can bring in here, I just found out yesterday that Timothy Snyder, who I have this awesome respect for as a writer and historian, his diagnosis, which I quoted, is one of the fellows here. I didn't realize that, but in his Blood Lens, which he was writing about what was going on in Central Europe about the same time that Husserl was writing this. He diagnosed there was a whole kind of cultural crisis. Now you say, where do I go this philosophically? This is my new agenda, which hasn't really been announced because it's all been happening. But what my new agenda, my new stab, you might say, into resolving the crisis, and I'm not alone in this, is what we call the revival of critical theory, the new critical theory that comes, critical crisis, crise, they all come, from the same, Greek root, which means this kind of active, indeterminate judgment in some respect. And I think in some ways that philosophy now, and what was critical theory originally? It was started by the Frankfurter Schule. It was an effort, in a sense, to try to bring an effort of social praxis and responsibility into what had become a kind of lazy Marxist materialism and its own kind of Wissenschaft and so forth. And I think that's what we need. We need this sense of crisis and a kind of new, deeper, more profounder critical discernment, which I think Derrida, his later writings, is trying to push us toward.
That will also be, that sounds quite reasonable because, at least for critical theory in its traditional form, so with the dialectics of enlightenment, the question of sacrifice was in fact, that was cut. So that's something that doesn't make any sense anymore. But in fact, I wonder whether this isn't sort of forgetfulness of the sacrificial logic. So we got to take it up. But the question is, what would that mean for what you understand by critical theory?
Yeah, and that's what we're working out.
Okay.
We've got a working group that's developing. In some ways, interestingly, I think some of the themes that I heard pronounced here, not every one of them, but most of them, are kind of, it's kind of very timely, even though it's untimely. That the question of the gift is sort of what coalesces, in terms of the strands of recent philosophy together to raise this issue of the crisis. And that's, I heard overtures in this particular direction. In some ways this is expository. This is what continental philosophy has kind of been going on, though probably more here in Europe than in America, because I think these kind of, the problem in America, Derrida was so popular, Derrida just became almost this sort of iconic fashion that nobody really truly understood. One of my, my own beruf is to make Derrida into a much more interesting, complicated philosophy that is generally regarded in America. So, I think we have our work cut out here for us, and I think we're doing that to a certain extent right now in these papers that we're giving.
Thank you. Yeah, I really enjoyed this. Thinking the back and forth between gift and force. This is something I've been thinking about for a few years now with you. You've been forcing
about
me.
it before.
Yeah.
I forced it on
Forcing on me. What if this is the new crisis of European sciences? What is
or
the
Wissenschaften.
Okay?
This is a different meaning.
Sure. Yeah. But what is the new crisis of global sciences? Is there such a thing? And we were talking about globalism earlier, so.
Well,
Take that.
it's what I would call the crisis of the discursive, and I think that the crisis of the discursive is being manifested politically. That's what my new forthcoming book is about. It's a crisis of liberal democracy. The whole notion that in some ways knowledge is this, gigantic grid of predicative logical determinations, or maybe moving dialectically in the Hegelian way, but still, it's about what we would call a balance of forces. A balance of forces which is the effort to try to come to some kind of ratio, what the Greeks call it sophrosyne, which was associated with wisdom. Liberal democracy is in crisis, and Husserl understood that in the 1930s, that the political crisis was inseparable from the epistemological crisis. And that's what he was getting at. What what it was unfolding then had not unfolded, so you only get illusions of that in the Vienna lectures. But I think we're in some ways in much the same crisis. You know, it's like, you look what's happening in Eastern Europe right now. Well, you listen to the American Secretary of State. So, well, you know, it's behaving like a 19th century power, not a 21st century power.